So do some of you watch our sermons online from time to time? I highly recommend it. That's what we're doing here. If you miss church one week, go onto our website, go under sermons, and you can actually see Joe or me preach. It's kind of fun, I guess. So how do we know the way? How do we know the way? The way to God, the way to live. Well, I want to tell you a story. Within the first 2 weeks of my arriving here at St. John's to be your rector, now getting close to 8 years ago, I attended this cocktail party auction on the weekend of the horse show. And I met many parishioners and all sorts of folks from the community that night. And frankly, I was so new, I didn't know who was in the church and who wasn't in the church. I didn't know a parishioner from a guest. So near the end of the evening, a woman I had met earlier came up to me and out of the blue asked me, "Do you believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life?" And I was sort of startled. Here I was in this sort of social setting and all of a sudden had a theological question. So I asked her what she meant when she was quoting the passage from the 14th chapter of John, at which point she simply repeated, "Do you believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life?" So I said to her, "Now tell me, what do you know about the Johannine community in the last decade of the 1st century in the neighborhood of Syria?" Well, she got this blank look on her face, and then she sort of just walked away. So it turns out, I think she had been a parishioner here before at St. John's and had left to join another church, and indeed it was an Inquisition, which I thought it might have been. I wasn't sure, and I guess I had flunked the litmus test. So anyway, and so although she wasn't interested in the Johannine community in the neighborhood of Syria in the last decade of the 1st century, let me tell you about it, okay? So just a couple of things. Jews and Christians worshipped together. You know, they worshiped together. We get our Sunday service because the Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah would go to their Saturday Sabbath at their synagogue, and half the congregation might go home after that at sundown, but the others who thought Jesus was the Messiah stayed, and they had dinner together. And so it was the beginning of Sunday, and that's how we ended up with Sunday as our worship. The other thing that folks don't realize is, at least around Jerusalem and Syria, Jews and Christians really were, those who believed that Jesus was the Messiah and those who weren't sure and those who did not, stayed in the same communities for, tens of years, for decades after Jesus had been crucified. So by 90 AD, around the time that the Gospel of John was written, 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion, death, and resurrection, finally these two camps of people were pulling apart. And that is, today we have an intact Jewish community that believes that Jesus was not the Messiah, and we have a whole host of Christians. And so, but there was this split happening. So embedded in the Gospel of John is a lot of stuff about two camps, of people testing each other to see if they could still live together before they broke apart. And thus, really, this morning's discourse from John that he is giving to his disciples as he is getting ready to go into Jerusalem to be crucified. So he's trying to assure them. He says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God and believe in me." So he's trying to assure them that everything they need for a faithful life is already at hand. And he's trying to reassure them that he is going to go before them, that his relationship with God is such that they are one, and that he will be ahead of them and going to them, before them, to God, to prepare the way. So, of course, typically the disciples object. Thomas says, "So what the heck are you really talking about here, Jesus? We don't know the way, and we're going to head out and get lost again." And Philip, well, he says, now Jesus, if you would just tell us exactly who the Father is, we'd be just fine. You know, of course. And so then we would understand. My mother had a wicked sense of humor. After she had died, and on her favorite notepad, I went back in to begin to look at her papers, scrambling around for the things I needed to prepare for her funeral. And right there was this New Yorker cartoon. And it had this woman flat on a bed, hooked up to some tubes, and the doctor said, is holding the husband, you know, with his arm around the husband, and says, "It's a very senior moment." And of course, she's dead. So that's the first thing I encounter from my mother after she has died, and I, of course, burst out laughing. She had a wicked sense of humor, even in her last days. She chose hospice care, and so all of her children came into town, you know, to visit her, and you know, she was supposed to die in 3 days, and she even thought it was funny that she didn't die in 3 days, you know, and she was all set, and she had told the doctor she wanted to go be with Jesus, and it was all going to be fine, and my siblings all came, and then eventually they really had to go back to their jobs and their families and their work. So as they were preparing to go back, you know, each of my brothers went in to visit her, and I have a twin brother whose Christianity has taken a little more of a fundamentalist turn, and so he was in there with my mother, who, by the way, had prayed his you-know-what through school and every one of the things wild things he had done in his life. But he was in there at her bedside, and he came out, and I took my brothers to the airport, and my sister went in to be with my mother while I took my brothers to the airport. And my sister told the story that when she got into the room, my mother, who could barely speak, said, my brother's name is Doug, said, "What the hell's wrong with Doug?" And nobody knew what that meant or anything. We got to the funeral, right? It was a graveside funeral down in Palm Beach, and my twin brother said he wanted to say something, so he got up in front of about 35 or 40 people gathered there, and he wanted to reassure us that he had done a very specific Jesus prayer, and that he knew, because he had done that prayer at Mother's bedside, that she was going to heaven. Well, Humpy would say that there are many paths to the same destination. Nobody laughed, right? Many paths to the same destination. And what Jesus says primarily in this passage is, don't be afraid. Remember what we have all shared. God is in me, I have been in the midst of you. Remember all of that. And if none of that works for you, remember the works themselves. Remember the works. The deaf hear, the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the dead are raised. Jesus even says, and you think that's a lot? If you believe in me, these things and greater you will do also, because I am going to the Father, and you will not miss my companionship, nor my power. These things and greater you will be able to do, not because you are so great, or even because I am so great. Jesus invariably never pointed to himself. He said, I do this at the will of my Father. You will be able to do these great things and greater because I am returning to God, and that is your source, and that is my source. And I am going ahead of you. I am going on your behalf. And of course, Jesus' words to these disciples were before his crucifixion. And we know from the story that Jesus really did go on all our behalf, all the way to the cross. So even more powerful after the resurrection are his bold promises to us in the passage today. Ask anything in my name, and I will do it. So how do we know the way to God? The way to live? Well, there is not one path. The path my brother took, that he needed reassurance that my mother could be on that same path. That may not be your path, may not be my path. I think of Humpy. He used to talk about if where we're going is the pinnacle of a mountain, some people might hike up and other people might drive on the road. Someone might take a helicopter and just land on the top. So there are all kinds of ways to get there. But I don't think there are any magic formulas that can save you, or some specific interpretation of Scripture that will guarantee that your life will go well and that you will be blessed by God. Because you know what? What Jesus was saying to his disciples, and we hear today, we hear, H-E-A-R today, we hear, you are already blessed by God. You've already been blessed, and there is a lot in Jesus' teaching that will help you to live a more authentic and a fuller life. But out of our fear and our need for certainty, if we will take just one of those paths, Jesus will walk with us. And if we can just believe that we are worthy of that attention and love, and head out into the world expecting to be empowered by the one who has gone ahead of us to the Father, the one who has gone before, well, who knows what we could accomplish? Oh, wait, Jesus does know even greater things than he has done. Amen.